My father exploded during the family gathering. I'm proud of all my children, except for the failure sitting at the table. I left, but what happened afterward left everyone in shock. I used to think there was something wrong with me, that maybe if I talked less, smiled more, tried harder, he would love me. But no matter what I did, my father never looked at me the way he looked at my brothers. Never with pride. Never with affection. Only indifference. Hi, my name is Alina, and growing up, I was invisible in my own family. My father Richard wasn't the type to yell. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to, his silence said everything. When I got excellent grades in elementary school, he barely nodded. But when my brother Jake passed a single subject he had been failing, Dad patted him on the back and said, "That's my boy." I was 12 years old when I noticed it for the first time. It was Father's Day. I had spent hours making a card, decorating it with shiny stickers and writing a poem myself. I gave it to him after dinner, my little heart bursting with hope. He glanced at it briefly, mumbled a "thanks," and turned back to the game on TV. 5 minutes later, my brother Ryan walked in and handed him a store-bought mug that said, "Number 1 Dad," and Dad acted like he had just received a Super Bowl trophy. I remember standing there with the card still clenched in my hand, wondering why mine wasn't enough. It was always like that. I was never enough. Ryan and Jake were the golden boys. Ryan was the athlete, always breaking school records and getting featured in the local paper. Jake was the charmer, winning over teachers, relatives, and basically anyone he met. And me? I was the quiet one. The moody girl who spent too much time in her room writing stories or drawing. My mother tried to balance things. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're special too, sweetheart." But even she knew the hierarchy in our home. If Ryan wanted the last slice of pizza, he took it. If Jake needed money, Dad gave it to him without a question. One time, I asked for a new sketchbook and Dad said, "What's the point? You'll just abandon it halfway through like everything else." That hurt more deeply than he'll ever know. At dinner, I sat silently while Dad asked my brothers about their plans, their goals, their day. He never asked me. If I did speak, it was usually met with a dismissive grunt or a forced smile. I learned to stay quiet, not to interrupt the boys' moment of glory. But inside, something was growing. Not just sadness. Something sharper, anger. A determination I couldn't yet name. I started working harder, pushing myself to stand out. Not because I thought he would notice, but because I wanted to matter to someone, even if that someone was just me. I stopped trying to earn his love. Instead, I focused on building a life he couldn't ignore. A version of me he would have no choice but to see. I was tired of being the forgotten daughter. One day, I promised myself, he would remember me, not as the quiet girl he overlooked, but as the woman who changed everything. If you walked into our house during the holidays, you'd think you were watching a commercial for the perfect American family. Laughter echoing from the kitchen. My brothers tossing a football in the backyard. Dad smiling with a beer in hand. But I knew the truth. I knew what it felt like to be the background in someone else's highlight reel. My brothers, Jake and Ryan, were born to shine, or at least that's how Dad made it seem. Jake, the eldest, could charm the stripes off a tiger. He was the kind of guy who never studied but somehow still passed with a wink and a grin. Dad adored him. They had inside jokes, matching fishing hats, and a handshake they made up when Jake was 10. I remember watching them once from the hallway as Jake showed Dad a business idea scribbled on a napkin. Dad looked at him like he had just solved world hunger. "That's my boy," he said, patting him on the back. "You've got the brain of a leader." Ryan, the youngest, was the golden athlete. Soccer trophies lined his shelves. Dad went to every game, rain or shine, shouting from the sidelines like a proud high school coach. After Ryan scored a winning goal, Dad threw an entire backyard party, barbecue, music, neighbors invited. I was there too, of course, setting plates, cleaning up. I got a good job once when I got into the honors program. Only once. No party, no dinner, just a single phrase in passing during breakfast, between bites of toast. Honors, huh? That's good. I stayed up late studying, pushed myself in every class, took part-time jobs to pay for extra courses. I earned certificates, received quiet awards, even got a scholarship. But my success never shone like theirs did in his eyes. At family dinners, Dad radiated pride as he talked about Jake's new startup or Ryan's training camp. I'd mention my internship at a prestigious firm and he'd nod, then go right back to talking to my brothers. Anyway, he'd say, "Jake, tell them about that investor meeting." The message was clear, they were the main event, I was the intermission. But the most painful part? I didn't hate my brothers. They were never cruel to me. Sure, they liked being the center of attention, but they never pushed me into the shadows. It was my father who did that, and I couldn't understand why. I tried everything, being helpful, being independent, being successful. Nothing worked. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized how much his favoritism crushed me. Other times, I knew he did and just didn't care. I told myself to let it go, to focus on myself, to not need his validation. But deep down, I still wanted it. Just once, I wanted him to say, "Today, I'm proud of you, Alina," not because he had to, but because he truly meant it. That moment never came. But another one did. One that would change everything. Not the way he expected, and certainly not the way he wanted. It was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of years spent burning the midnight oil, sacrificing social nights, drowning in self-doubt. I had built my own little startup, an innovative digital platform that was on the brink of revolutionizing the local market. It wasn't just a business. It was the embodiment of every sleepless night, every tear, and every silent moment of determination. I had poured my soul into it, believing that finally, my worth would be undeniable. The launch event was held in a sleek, modern conference hall downtown. Investors, local press, and industry leaders arrived, their eyes filled with curiosity and expectation. I stepped onto the stage with a trembling mix of excitement and fear, my heart pounding as if trying to escape the confines of my chest. I began to speak about my vision, the numerous obstacles I had overcome, and the promise of a brighter future that my platform represented. The room was silent, hanging on every word I spoke. For the first time, I felt seen, truly seen, for what I had achieved on my own merit. After the presentation, the energy in the room shifted. Handshakes and congratulations flowed, and I even caught snippets of praise from experienced investors who saw real potential in my work. With a cautious smile, I stepped into a quieter corner, allowing myself a brief moment of relief and pride. However, as the night went on, that pride would soon be shattered. Later that week, the family gathered at home for a celebration dinner, a routine gathering that was as much about showcasing accomplishments as it was about reaffirming the family's hierarchy. In the softly lit dining room, my brothers arrived with their usual effortless confidence, each trading stories of victories and milestones. The air was thick with unspoken triumphs that had long since become crystallized in our family's tradition of favoritism. As dinner began, my father Richard took his usual place at the head of the table. Conversation flowed, but inevitably, the topic shifted toward achievements. I waited for a moment of quiet recognition, a feeling, a word of respect. But instead, the narrative quickly turned. My father, with his well-rehearsed ease, began recounting the family's latest triumphs. "Ryan hit his third home run this season," he said, his voice brimming with pride, pausing for the laughter of gathered relatives. "And Jake, I heard you just closed another big deal for your new venture. Fantastic work, son." His words flowed like well-rehearsed lines in a family play, each one earning its expected round of applause. I cleared my throat, trying to insert my voice into the conversation. "I just launched my own venture," I began, hopeful. But before I could elaborate, my father cut me off with a dismissive wave. Yes, we know you're busy, dear." He said it lightly, almost as if referring to a trivial chore. The room fell into a brief, awkward silence. A few nods were exchanged, but no one caught the tone of triumph in my voice. That brief dismissal, that cold interruption, sent a jolt through me. I remembered the countless times I had announced my small victories, only to see them reduced to background noise, overshadowed by my brother's grand praises. In that moment, the weight of every ignored effort, every dismissed achievement, and every unspoken slight crashed over me like a giant wave. The seeds of change had been planted. Sitting there, amidst the clamor of celebration for my brothers, I felt a fierce, burning clarity. I realized that no matter how high I climbed or how many places I reached, I would never be recognized by the one person whose approval I had so desperately longed for. It was in that heartbreaking instant that I understood I could no longer play the silent role in this tragic family drama. I would build a life so bright, so undeniable, that he could no longer dismiss me. And if he kept stealing my moments, then maybe, finally, he would face the consequences of his endless favoritism. After that dinner, something inside me shut down, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I stopped trying. Not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of no longer chasing validation that would never come. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't ask to be heard anymore. I simply went quiet. I started spending less time at family gatherings and more time in silence, just me and my goals. I moved out of the city, rented a modest but quiet apartment on the outskirts, and immersed myself in my work as if it were oxygen. The startup I had launched, barely acknowledged by my own family, became my world. It didn't pay much at first. There were weeks when dinner was just toast and instant coffee. I had to take on side freelance projects to stay afloat. There were nights when I cried silently under my desk, questioning if I was really cut out for this. But for every doubt, there was a flash of determination. I had no one clapping for me, no one cheering me on, but finally, I was building something for myself. I learned how to fix mistakes, write proposals, handle rejections, and chase down clients with the kind of hunger only someone used to being overlooked could understand. Some nights, I scrolled through social media and saw photos of Jake at business conferences with Dad by his side, or Ryan holding another trophy with a caption about making the family proud. I'd feel that familiar sting, like an old wound reopening, but I didn't let it stop me. Instead, I'd take a deep breath, close the app, and get back to work. My success wouldn't come from applause. It would come from perseverance. I grew in silence, no flashy updates, no family newsletters, just long nights, stubborn effort, and the occasional client saying, "You're the only one who really listened to what we needed." Those words meant more to me than anything my father could have said, because they were real. After a year, the company started gaining traction. Our user base grew. A niche investor saw potential in what we were doing and injected seed capital. I finally hired a small team, people who, like me, knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Together, we built something incredible. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't send the usual holiday emails. I didn't show up at family events with stories of success to toss around like confetti. I let them assume I was the same girl in the background, living small. That's how I wanted it. But inside, everything was changing. My posture changed. My voice grew firmer. I was no longer afraid to take up space. I didn't need their validation. I had found something better, I had found myself. For the first time in my life, I made decisions without hesitation. I bought my first car on my own. I signed the lease for a sleek office space with floor-to-ceiling windows. And I did it without needing anyone to say, "Good job." I became the woman I once only dreamed of becoming, the one my younger self thought she had to become for them. But now, I was doing it for me. And in all that silence, I was building something far more powerful than a career. I was building freedom. I still remember the first time I passed a mirror and didn't shrink away. My reflection no longer looked like the forgotten daughter. It looked like someone who had pulled herself out of invisibility and crafted a life of her own design. And it wasn't loud or flashy, it was silent strength, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen. But it could no longer be ignored. And soon, neither could I, especially not after what I was about to do. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even for the obligatory phone calls. The silence was mutual. No one reached out to ask how I was doing, and I didn't expect them to. That's what it means to be forgotten. Eventually, you grow comfortable with your own absence. But this year, I made a decision. I confirmed my attendance for the annual Father's Day dinner. No explanation, no follow-up, just a simple, "I'll be there," in the family group chat. The reactions were a mix of emojis and passive silence. I could almost feel the discomfort through the screen. The night before, I stood in front of a sleek black luxury car at a dealership, signing papers under a false last name, one I had legally changed after launching my business. They wouldn't even recognize it. None of them had ever asked what I was doing or who I was becoming. Beside me was a small black envelope, its edges crisp, the paper heavy and expensive. Inside was a single legal document that would change everything. Father's Day arrived. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind myself of who I had become. Confidence in every inch of fabric, power in every step. When I pulled into the driveway with the car, the engine purred like a warning. My brothers were already there, toasting and laughing in the yard. Dad was at the head of the table, smiling broadly, drink in hand, playing his favorite role again. His eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, confusion cracked his usual smugness. Then a smile. Well, look who finally decided to show up. Everyone turned. I could feel their surprise and judgment settling into the air. I smiled politely. Hi, everyone. Happy Father's Day, Dad. The dinner was the usual mix of forced laughter and subtle digs. Jake talked about his new apartment. Ryan bragged about another promotion. Dad nodded and glowed like a king surrounded by princes. And then, the moment came. I stood slowly, the silence pulling everyone's attention toward me. I brought something for you, I said, looking directly at Dad. I stepped out, leaving the door open behind me. Moments later, I drove the luxury car up to the polished front entrance, jet black, impossible to ignore. I stepped out, walked back inside, and placed the small black envelope on the table in front of him. For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day. Gasps rippled through the room. Is that a car? Jake asked, squinting toward the entryway. Ryan leaned forward. Wait, you bought that? Dad looked from the keys to me, completely stunned. He picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. What is this? Just open it, I said calmly, my voice steady and composed. Everyone leaned in as he slid the paper out. For a second, his expression didn't change. Then his eyes began scanning the page, and slowly his face drained of color. His jaw clenched. What is this? He barked, now looking at me. I gave him a long, unreadable smile. Read it carefully. You'll see. And with that, I turned, walked out the door, and got into the car. I drove away as the shouting began behind me. Because that envelope wasn't just paper. It was the ownership document of the company I had just acquired, the firm where he worked. His job, his pride, his status, all now under my control. Happy Father's Day, indeed. The house still looked the same, tastefully decorated, immaculate, cold. My mother moved in and out of the dining room like a quiet shadow, refilling glasses and smiling at jokes that weren't funny. My brothers had already had several drinks, and the air felt thick with old habits and unspoken rules. I sat silently at the end of the table, the black envelope resting in my purse, heavy as a heartbeat. The car keys were safely tucked in my coat pocket, parked right outside the window in full view of the entryway. The conversation swirled around me, as if I wasn't even there. Ryan spoke about his latest investment win. Jake made jokes about people who still rent. And Dad, of course, nodded in approval, soaking up the pride like sunlight. So how's work going, Dad? Jake asked, raising his glass. Dad laughed. Busy, as always. But you know, not everyone is cut out for this kind of pressure. It takes real grit. Then he turned to Ryan. Good thing I have two sons who aren't afraid to lead, he said. I raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. Then he looked down the table in my direction. I could feel the moment shift even before he opened his mouth. And then there's the failure sitting at the table, he said, gesturing toward me with a mocking smile. Still pretending to be the black sheep, huh? Laughter erupted. Jake nearly choked on his drink. Ryan laughed so hard he had to hit the table. My hand remained folded in my lap. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just waited. When the laughter finally died down, I stood slowly, calmly, the way you move when you already know how the story ends. Actually, I brought something for you, Dad, I said, pulling the envelope from my purse. A small Father's Day gift. The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop. I walked along the table and placed the envelope directly in front of him. He looked at it, intrigued. What's this? Just open it, I said. Then I stepped back and crossed my arms. He tore the flap with a dramatic flourish, like he expected a prank or some cash. His fingers unfolded the paper, and as his eyes began to scan the words, the color in his face changed, first confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, creeping horror. What the hell is this? He asked, narrowing his eyes at me. Do you remember Anderson Tech? I said softly. The company you've worked for the past 10 years? It's under new ownership. A pause. I bought it, I continued. Through a silent acquisition. Effective as of last week. The silence was instant. Deafening. I leaned in slightly and added, so no, I'm not the failure at this table. I'm the woman who just became your boss's boss. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Jake looked pale. Ryan dropped his fork. Oh, and that car outside? I said, glancing toward the window. That was part of the presentation. But I'll be taking it with me now. I turned without waiting for permission, walked out, and slid into the driver's seat. The sound of the engine roared to life, and just as I began to drive away, I heard it, his shout from the open front door. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The engine purred steadily as I pulled away from the house. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, the weight of what I had just done settling in my chest. This was no longer about revenge. It was something much deeper. For years, I had allowed myself to be diminished in the shadows of a family that never truly saw me. And now I stood tall, casting a shadow they could no longer ignore. But the weight of the moment wasn't the only thing pulling at me. I knew what was happening behind me. I could imagine it as clearly as if I were still sitting at that table, hearing the deafening silence that followed my words. I wasn't there anymore, but my actions would speak louder than anything I could have said in that room. My father's hands trembled as he held the paper. He looked from the document to his sons, his lips moving as if trying to find words that wouldn't come. I could see the panic beginning to bloom, creeping through every muscle in his body, spreading like a virus. Dad? Jake asked, his voice suddenly small. He stood up, moving closer to where Dad sat frozen, the paper still tightly gripped in his hands. What's going on? Ryan, always confident, had also stood up, trying to look over his father's shoulder. What is it? Wait, is it real? Dad didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the document, his fingers sliding down the words but unable to make sense of them. The words on the page were simple enough, but for him, they were a death sentence. I could already hear the questions forming in his mind, the panic, the disbelief, the frantic scramble to understand what was happening. They had always relied on him for answers. Now the answers were slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Finally, Jake couldn't take the silence any longer. Dad, what does it say? What's going on? Dad looked up, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't breathe. It's a transfer of ownership, he murmured, his voice weak. An asset reversion. All of it, the company, the house, my shares. The panic in his voice was palpable. His sons froze. Ryan blinked in disbelief. Wait, are you saying this document means she owns everything? The realization hit them like a slap. The silence deepened. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. My father had always been the pillar, the one everyone turned to for stability. But now, he was the one on his knees, his empire crumbling before his eyes. His sons had no idea how to process this. Jake stumbled back from the table, his face turning red. How the hell how could she do this? He stammered, his voice rising in anger. She's nothing. We're the ones who worked for this. How could? Dad raised a trembling hand, his mind still trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. She's not nothing, he said, his voice cracking. She's everything. Ryan's eyebrows furrowed, his former arrogance replaced by uncertainty. What do you mean, Dad? What's going on? How could she? She owns everything, Dad said, his voice barely a whisper. She owns the company. She owns the house. Everything I worked for, it's all hers now. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The sons who once idolized their father, who saw him as the king of their world, now faced a reality they could barely comprehend. They had never even considered me a competitor. To them, I was the shadow, the forgotten one, the one who wasn't good enough. But now I was the one with the power. I don't understand, Jake said, his voice trembling. How? When did this happen? Why didn't we know? Dad finally looked up, his face etched with defeat. She didn't want you to know. She didn't need to tell you. She doesn't need us. Ryan took a step back, trying to pull himself together. But how did she get so much? How? She didn't ask for anything, Dad said, his voice now cold. She just took it. The room was frozen in disbelief, the aftermath of betrayal, of my silent and calculated rise settling over all of them. For the first time in their lives, my brothers were forced to confront the truth they had been blind to for years. I was not the failure they thought I was. I was the one who had worked silently, without applause, without validation. And now, everything they depended on belonged to me. My father let out a long, shaky breath. She's smarter than I thought, he murmured, his voice barely audible, and I'll never be able to take that back. The fear, the panic, it was all there, written across their faces. But for me, it was the beginning of something new, the beginning of claiming my place in the world. Not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who had finally earned her right to be seen. I didn't look back as I drove away from that house. The weight that had been holding me down for so long, the constant need to prove myself, the hunger for approval that would never come, had finally lifted. I had done it. Not because they recognized me, but because I had recognized myself. The phone vibrated with messages. The family was scrambling, trying to figure out what I had done, why I had left so suddenly, and what that document meant. I knew they were in shock, especially my father. But I didn't care. I had already taken what I needed from them, the power to stand on my own, to walk away from everything I once thought I needed. I was not the girl they always ignored. I was not the daughter they thought they could control or discard. I was my own person now, free from the chains of their expectations. As the night wore on, I knew they were probably still sitting there, staring at that paper, trying to comprehend the magnitude of it. My father, who had always dismissed my efforts, would now understand what I was truly capable of. But it would be too late. All those years of neglect, of treating me like I was second best, had finally caught up to him. The house would never be the same again. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer someone they could manipulate or overlook. The brothers who had always competed for his affection, who never saw me as a real equal, would finally understand that I was not just a background player in their world. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love or recognition. I had built a life for myself that didn't depend on them. I was successful, independent, and finally at peace. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who had fought for her place in the world, someone who didn't need to look back to know she had won. The door was closed. I had walked out, but I had also stepped into my own future. One that was entirely mine. If you liked the story, leave your thoughts in the comments, don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time.